All right, guys, welcome into lecture number 9 on the book of Numbers for Religion 101. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer and we'll get things started. God, I thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to be here. I pray, Father, even though it's like this and not in person, God, I thank you for technology that enables us to do this. Father, I pray that you be with each and every one of these students and that during this short time together that they would be blessed by what your word has to tell us and to show us more about who you are. God, I pray that you would keep them all safe and that you would give us ears to hear, eyes to see, that we might behold wondrous things from your word. Bless our time now in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, as we're getting started, the first thing that I would want you to do is just take a few minutes. If you've got your handout there, this is lecture number 9, so get out class handout number 9. I apologize, it's got the wrong date on top, so just pay that no attention. But as of right now, we're going to start things off with your outline video of the book of Numbers. So check this out, and we'll be right back to get on with the lecture.
The Book of Numbers. This fourth book of the Bible carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near his holy presence in the tabernacle. So the book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised Abraham. Now, the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the Promised Land. Now, the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness, and immediately things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the Promised Land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the Promised Land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the Promised Land. Now, you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion, and they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now, as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the Promised Land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and to lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol, but it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin. But even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab, and the first main part of the section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham from Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now, it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp, grumbling and rebelling, but up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness, that's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
All right, guys, so if you're ready, here we go. Follow along with your handout and fill out the answers as they come up. So the Israelites have been at Mount Sinai for roughly a year's time at this point. Now after all that they've been through since leaving Egypt, that's the 10 Commandments, their rebellion with the golden calf, the establishment of the offerings, the feasts, and the purity requirements that we talked about in the previous lecture. All of these things before God, they're ready now at this point to set off on their journey to the Promised Land. Before they begin their journey, however, a census is taken to number the people, which is where we get the book of Numbers. It's where it gets its name. The tribes, they're divided up into specific camps around the tabernacle. So you guys are familiar with the way the tabernacle is set up. And this will be the structure of their setup wherever they stop along their journey. So whenever they stop and camp, they're supposed to be camped out in a specific way. All right. So now here's the interesting thing. What should have taken them just a few weeks to journey from Mount Sinai to Canaan actually ends up taking them 40 years due to their constant rebellion against God and their constant grumbling. It's worth noting right now at this point that we have to almost go back to Genesis 48 and see where Joseph actually blesses his sons by the name of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the tribe of Joseph, is really divided up into those two groups. You've got Manasseh and Ephraim, which both constitute the tribe of Joseph. So if you're ready with your handout, take a look. Let's go over the campsite. You can see the diagram right there to the right. And let's take a look at these. We're going to start with number 1. We're going to go all the way up to number 14 so you guys can see how this works out. The first, of course, is the tabernacle. That's right there in the center. Now, keep in mind, this is how they would camp every single time that they stopped along their journey. The tabernacle would have to be set up. They couldn't just leave the parts in the cart. They would have to get it all out. They'd have to set the whole tabernacle up anytime that they made camp, and then they were to continue to worship God as they were. Number 2 was the Levites or the priest. The Levites were the only tribe where the priests would come from, and they were camped out all around the tabernacle. From there, let's draw attention to the far left side. Number 3, we're going to go all the way across. 3, 4, and 5 to the left of the tabernacle. 6, 7, and 8 to the right of the tabernacle. 3, 4, and 5, here we have the tribes of Joseph. That's Ephraim and Manasseh, as well as the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin, of course, being technically the youngest of the sons of Jacob, but then you got Joseph's sons in there, Ephraim and Manasseh. 6, 7, and 8. And by the way, feel free, I'm not going to pause and necessarily give you time to write things down. Just, you've got the ability to pause this whenever you want, so feel free to do that. 6, 7, and 8, we have Zebulun, Issachar, and Judah. Numbers 9, 10, and 11, we have Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. And Numbers 12, 13, and 14, we have Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. All right, these are the tribes and how they would have camped out around the tabernacle whenever they stopped to rest. Okay, here we have the marching order. Now, here's the way that they would be laid out in order of how they would move. We've already seen how they will stay still. Now, let's see how they move. First of all the way out in front, you have the Ark of the Covenant, Moses, and Aaron. Whenever they would move, they would always move in line in this direction. So Moses and Aaron would lead them along with the Ark of the Covenant. And then we have Judah. Number 3 is Issachar. Number 4 is Zebulun. Number 5, you have the tribe of Levi. Now, again, remember, the Levites were where the priests come from. It was the priest's job to take care of the tabernacle. And so they would carry the sections of the tabernacle as the Levitical priests, as the Levites. And so here you're going to have, between these groups of people, you're going to have a section of the tabernacle being carried by the Levites. So number 5 is the tribe of Levi, and this was specifically the priests carrying the tabernacle curtains. All right. Then you have Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. And now number 9 is going to be another group of the tribe of Levi. This time they are carrying the tabernacle furniture. If you remember the table of showbread, the altar of incense, the lampstand, all of these things would have been carried right here at this part of the march. And then 10 through 15 are as follows. Ephraim, of course, son of Joseph, and as well as Manasseh, number 11. Benjamin, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. So there is your marching order whenever they were on the move. So we've had our campsite, how they would camp during the night when they were stationary, and then how they would move when they are marching. Now, they take a few road trips. Like I said, it takes 40 years for them to get through this, all right? And so road trip number 1, let me just take a few minutes here and break this down for you before we get to the last part of the handout there. Road trip number 1 takes place in Numbers chapter 10 through 12. The people, once again, they begin complaining. And when I say road trip, by the way, I mean they pick everything up and they march. They're marching to the promised land. So in Numbers 10 through 12, the people begin complaining. They say, we're tired of manna. That's all they're eating. We're tired of manna. It was better in Egypt. And even Aaron and Miriam, all right, Moses' own brother and sister, they start bad-mouthing Moses in front of everyone. You know, what makes Moses so special? So Moses is dealing with all of this stuff in the first road trip. Now, they come into, on this first road trip, after that takes place, they eventually come into the wilderness of Paran. Now, this is Numbers 13 through 19. Moses sends out 12 spies to scout out the promised land, that's Canaan. 10 of them come back saying that Israel doesn't stand a chance against the Canaanites. However, 2 others, Joshua and Caleb, and this is the same Joshua that will succeed Moses, they say that the land is plentiful and that God will indeed give them the land. Now the people are convinced. Well, first of all, my question would be, who do you think the rest of the people of Israel are going to believe? The 10 guys or the two? The people are convinced that they are as good as dead, and they try to rise up against Moses and appoint a new leader who will take them back to Egypt. Moses then intercedes for the people before God, but God determines that this generation will not enter the promised land, but their children will. The rest of them are sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Daggone. In other words, God gives them what they want. He lets them jump out of the fishbowl. So there you go. There's that again. Road trip number 2 comes in Numbers 20 through 21. Remember, they're still marching like we see there at the bottom of the screen. The people, they're thirsty, so they start complaining again, and God tells Moses to speak to a rock so that water might come out of it. But Moses, in his frustration, now this is pretty wild here, in his frustration, he strikes the rock instead of declaring it, and declares to the people that, quote, we, end quote, have to keep providing water for them. Now that was Moses' mistake there. God told him to speak to the rock, but instead he strikes the rock, and he declares to the people that we, as in, if Moses is bringing something to the table here, Moses is giving himself credit here somehow, have to keep providing water for them. So God then declares that even Moses, will not enter the promised land as well due to his own disobedience. So after this, the Israelites rebel again, and God brings about a very weird judgment on the people. He sends, believe it or not, poisonous snakes to come and to bite them. Now here we have a kind of a picture of the gospel, because Jesus is even going to reference this right after John 3:16. He's going to reference this just as Moses, or maybe even right before. He says, even as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. So it's pointing us again to Jesus. So Moses intercedes for the people of God again. God then commands Moses to make a bronze serpent, place it on a pole, and whoever looks at the serpent will be healed and ultimately be saved. Now, at the end of road trip number 2, they reach the plains of Moab. This is Numbers 22 through 36. Now, we're covering a lot of ground here. We're almost to the end of your handout here. But before we do that, let's look at this real quick. The Israelites enter Moab, and the king of Moab, whose name is Balak, wants them gone. All right, so he summons a pagan sorcerer by the name of Balaam to come and curse them. Now, this is the same Balaam whose donkey ends up talking to him, because if you've grown up in church at all, you may have heard this story. The donkey sees the angel of the Lord and speaks to Balaam to spare his life. Then the Lord tells Balaam to do to Moab and proclaim exactly what he will tell him. So the king of Moab commands Balaam to curse the Israelites while they are camped near Moab. He tells him to do this 3 times. 3 times Balaam tries and can only pronounce blessings on the people of Israel. So God then gives Balaam this vision of Jesus, who would come and establish God's kingdom forever. So from Numbers 26 to 36, we see that the children of Israel, that is the next generation, begin preparation to enter the promised land. Now, how does all of this point us to Jesus? Number 1, we are reminded, here it is. How does Numbers, the book of Numbers, point us to Jesus? Number 1, we see manna from heaven, and we see this as Jesus even talks about himself and declares himself as the bread of life, which has come down from the Father in John chapter 6. Second of all, we see the bronze serpent. We've already made mention of this. That is John 3:14. I said it comes after earlier. I meant to say before. Before Jesus says, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, he says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And then you have Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24, which speaks of the Messiah who is to come. So there we have it, guys. That is the outline for the book of Numbers. Right now, I want you to take a look at this final video on the book of Numbers from thebibleproject.com, and I will see you guys at the next lecture.
The book of Numbers gets overlooked, partly because it has a really boring name.
Which is a shame. In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories. But let's remember, it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are 3 wilderness locations, broken up by 2 road trips that link all the pieces together.
The first wilderness section is Mount Sinai, right here on the map.
And then in the second section, they travel to a region called Paran.
A whole bunch of things happen here in the wilderness of Paran.
And then in this 4th section is Israel's road trip to Moab.
The book ends with a large section in the wilderness of Moab, right across the Jordan River from the Promised Land.
Now, through all of these sections, the storyline just flows like a gripping dramatic movie. Everything starts great, but then the trip goes horribly wrong, and it all ends with the final redemptive moment, the surprising act of God's grace.
So let's jump into this story. It all begins at the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and we've become really familiar with this mountain.
Yeah, if you remember, Israel came here after Egypt, and they formed a covenant with God here, got the 10 Commandments here, built the tabernacle here, and they've been at this mountain for 1 full year.
And now they take a census to number the people as they prepare to leave.
Right, and they're given these instructions for how to organize all those people in the camp. God's presence in the tabernacle, and then the tribe of Levi and the priests around it, and then the rest of the tribes around them. And this pattern, it's this visual symbol for how God's holiness is at the center of their existence as a people.
And they're told that when the cloud of God's presence moves, they're to pack up and travel with it.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant is carried by the Levites out in front, and then the tribe of Judah, and on and on. And this order is also a symbol for how God's holy presence is their leader and guide through the wilderness.
We begin the second section of the book with enthusiasm as they leave Mount Sinai and travel up to Paran. God's with them, everything's organized. This is going to be great.
But it's not great. After just 3 days on the road, the people are complaining about their hunger and thirst, and then even Moses' brother and sister start bad-mouthing him in front of all the people.
Not a great start. But now we're into the third section, the wilderness of Paran. This is where they send the 12 spies to scout out the Promised Land. 2 of those spies come back, and they're really optimistic.
But the other 10 are freaked out, and they don't trust God, and they go around saying, we're going to get annihilated in there. And so they start a mutiny, and they try to appoint a new leader who's going to take all the people back to Egypt. And so basically, they are refusing to go into the Promised Land, and God honors their choice. He says that this generation is going to wander for 40 years and die in the wilderness, and only their kids will get to enter the Promised Land.
You know, this story here gets brought up many times in the Bible by different authors.
Yeah, and it always serves as a reminder that while God remains faithful to his people and his promises, he will honor their choices. He'll let them waste their whole lives if they choose to live in rebellion.
Okay, so the trip's been a disaster so far.
And it gets worse here in this 4th section as they're traveling to Moab. Even Moses has a moment of rebellion and is disqualified from entering the Promised Land. Then there's another rebellion among the people that results in this snake attack. And what makes all these rebellions even worse is that every step of the way, God has been providing. He's been offering forgiveness. He's been giving them food and water and this crazy stuff called manna.
Yeah, what is that stuff?
Yeah, no idea. But in spite of all this, they keep complaining, and they say that they wish they had died in slavery in Egypt.
If I was God, I would just give up on these guys.
You would think. But that's what makes this story in the final section so surprising. Israel has just arrived in Moab, and the king of Moab, he's freaked out that this huge group of people is traveling through his land. So he hires this pagan sorcerer named Balaam to pronounce curses on them.
This guy means business.
Yeah, and so Balaam, he says, okay, I'm going to pray to the Hebrew God, and let's see what happens. And 3 different times he attempts to curse them, but each time he finds that he can utter only blessing. Most surprising is the last blessing, where he prophesies that out of Israel will rise a victorious king. And this king is somehow going to be connected to God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations through this family. So here's Israel rebelling down in the camp, totally unaware that up in the hills, God is protecting and even blessing them.
The book ends here in Moab. Israel's getting ready to go into the Promised Land, They count up everyone again, just like at the beginning. They're leaving the old generation behind, including Moses.
But before they leave Moses, he gives them his last words of warning and wisdom. And that speech is what the next book, Deuteronomy, is all about.